Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Spud Smart Roundtable Series webinar. My name is Ashley Robinson, and I'm the editor of Spud Smart. Today, I'll be serving as your host for this webinar. Today's theme is getting your potato field ready for winter and spring planting. I'd like to take a quick minute to thank our sponsor, McCain, for partnering with us on this roundtable webinar. Today we have two presenters who are very knowledgeable on the subject, and I'm excited to have them here. We have Jeff Miller, who is the president and CEO of Miller Research, and Manful Fazera, who is a senior scientist and manager of McCain's Farm of the Future. In today's webinar, you'll learn a lot. One of the things that you're mainly going to learn about is McCain's Farm of the Future, how they are experimenting with fall ridging, where ridges are made and cover crops are planted at the same time, plus different management strategies being investigated for the best ways to terminate the fall fry cover crops in the spring. And you'll learn about the fall ridging benefits and how it expedites potato planting, reduces labor and fuel costs, removes the need to harrow the ground in the spring, and more. During the presentation, you'll likely have some questions for our speakers. Please type these into the chat box at any time during the webinar, and we'll address them during the question and answer session after the presentations. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be made available at spudsmart.com following this live event. Jeff Miller is the president and CEO of Miller Research, and he's going to be our first presenter today. He was raised on a farm in southern Iowa. Jeff earned a Bachelor of Science degree in botany and biotechnology from the Brigham Young University in 1994, and has a Master of Science degree in 1996 and PhD degree in 1998 in plant pathology from Washington State University, working on potato late blight. He worked for 2 years at the University of Minnesota and 6 years at the University of Idaho in Aberdeen as a potato pathologist, conducting research on pink rot, powdery scab, early blight, late blight, skiller surf, black dot, rhizotonia, and verticillium wilt. And Jeff now operates his own business in southern Idaho called Miller Research, where he conducts research on crop production and pest management. Take it away, please, Jeff.
Okay, thank you for that nice introduction. And today, my goal is to give you an overview of the things that we typically do or consider. Is we are this time of year, ending the summer, going into fall, and preparing for potatoes in the coming year. And I will emphasize that this is very much based on the experience that I have here in southern Idaho. And so there may be times I say things that you may feel, well, that doesn't apply directly to me. And that may be the case based on your geography or where you're producing. But hopefully the things I share, they may at least trigger a thought or spark some thinking about ways that we can improve the ground and get ready. And I do think that when you're going to plant potatoes the following year, for us, it really does start quite early. We have to think about this when we're growing the previous crop and before we've actually even harvested it. So I'd like to start off with, I love this picture of this gentleman here who has really had a great idea. But other than buy himself a snowplow, he figured out a better way to do it. And while we may smile or laugh at this, sometimes this is the way that farmers feel when they start experimenting with different management practices. They may feel like they're just strapping a cardboard box on the front of something and saying, well, I hope that this works. And trying to find data to say, is what I'm doing going to give me any benefit or return on my dollar? So this is a picture actually of the field down here at the bottom of the slide that I will be planting potatoes in next year. And this was taken shortly after the wheat was harvested off the field. And prior to the dry down of the wheat, we want to go out and sample for nematodes and while the crop is still growing and still healthy before the soil dries out. That's going to give me a sense for what might be there the following year. After I've done that, there'll be all kinds of different things needed in the fall, the groundwork to prepare. I also need to think about the residue of the previous crop. Now, in this example here, the farmer that we rent this ground out, and the farmer who grew the wheat, they cut it really, really close to the ground because they wanted to bail off all the straw. And that is not always the case down here. There are some times where they will leave straw. And where I have the camera lined up, if you look down the rows, or you can see there's a concentration of green there. That's the chaff row. If that isn't dealt with or managed some way, that will cause really poor potato growth the following year. So we have to do things to manage the residue. We also, in our area, we have to use water. In this case, we want to sprout any remaining seed. In some cases, we may have salt buildup in the soil that we want to leach down and get it out of the root zone. And we don't always have access to that water where we're at. Here where I grow in southern Idaho, we get about just over 10 inches of rain a year, most of that being in from December through March. And so we don't have a lot of it comes during the growing season. So here when I'm in August and September, when I'm trying to get the ground ready to go into winter, sometimes I have to apply a fair amount of irrigation. And I will add that I may not always have access to that water. And that will become later when we talk about some of the practices that we work on. So there are multiple cultivations that we may do to take care of the residue. We may look at fumigation, which I'll talk about. Then we'll also want to mark out the rows in the fall so that it's ready to go the following spring. So with nematodes, the idea here is I want to get my best estimate. I want to sample when the numbers are the highest. And so you want to do that when your previous crop is present and growing. We try to shoot for a month before harvest if we can. You also want to do it before the ground is frozen. Now, of course, if you're following the first point, you're not going to have to worry about the second point. But if you are a little late, it's better than nothing. The problem is, like if you're growing a wheat crop and the farmer has turned off the water, some of those migratory nematodes will go down. They will try to move down lower in the soil where they'll find moisture. Any that stay up high, as the soil dries out, they will die. And so if you're waiting and pulling soil samples later in the season, you may get an artificially low number that won't reflect what's really out there. And when you get those samples, you want to protect them from either getting too hot or drying out through desiccation. So once you pull those samples, you want to store them in a cool place. We store them in our refrigerator prior to shipping and make sure that they get to the lab on time. And we've had many cases where growers have waited, like say in a wheat crop, until they've shut off the water. They may even wait till after they've harvested. They go out and they'll pull soil sample and they'll say, gee, I have almost no nematodes out there. But in actuality, they've all disappeared. They have all migrated downward and are not present anymore. You get to fall tillage. It's really important that we get the residue the previous crop residue incorporated. Oftentimes, fertilizer will also be applied at this time, and this varies. I wouldn't say there's one standard practice. And many times, growers are not adding fertilizer just in case things change and they decide not to use a certain field. The level of uncertainty sometimes will prevent fall fertilizer applications, but there is some that is made. We also will do cultivation to break up any compacted soil layers. This will vary depending on the crop that was grown before. But we also want to improve water infiltration. When we get time to preparing for planting, we want to mark out the rows. And the reason we do this in the fall is it allows any freezing and thawing that will occur through the winter to help loosen up that soil. We have actually done some on-farm trials where we look at marking out in the spring versus marking out in the fall. And you see a clear increase in the number of clods that come up from a spring mark out versus a fall mark out for us. The other thing about doing a fall mark out is you're able to go in and plant, as soon as possible. You don't have to wait for another cultivation to happen. Now, I will add to this is that any tillage at all is really not considered friendly for soil health. This, in my mind, is one of the biggest challenges we have going forward in trying to, I guess we try to talk about being sustainable. That means different things to different people. I personally believe that potato farmers are very sustainable and that we have done a very good job trying to optimize many of the systems that we have. But there still is this pressure to show that we're doing even more. And sometimes we don't know if that more actually brings any benefit to us. There have been some big measures or programs to try to get greater adoption of what some would consider soil health friendliness. And again, a lot of times those go back to cutting out tillage. But when most of these are done in systems where potatoes aren't grown, at least that's been my experience down here in the United States, is that some of the most common programs that are recommended for growers in improving their soil health they're not done with root crops, something that's grown underground, because the harvest typically is a significant cultivation event. So give you my example fall tillage plan down here. Shortly, usually potatoes are following a small grain. And so we will come in with a McFarland harrow, which we're only probably going in 1, maybe 2 inches in the soil. We try to be as light as we can. And the idea here is we want to scatter and break up any residue that's out there. So if we have chaff rows that are out in the field, we want to spread that chaff out. We want to get contact between any residual grain seed that might be out there with the soil. And then we're going to irrigate to get those seeds to germinate. So depending on the year, I may irrigate anywhere from 3 to 4 inches in the fall. So this is water being applied to the crop or to the field without any crop being grown. If I have to leach salts out, then I'm going to be on the high end of that. And that's very difficult to do sometimes. If I need to germinate seeds, I probably don't need to put on all that much. But once I get that going and get those plants to germinate, I may dry disc it 1 to 2 times. That's to remove these germinated plants, the germinated grain typically. If I don't do that, then what happens is I have this mass of these root masses that are quite difficult to plant through the following spring. I will come in with a disc ripper at that time to break up any compacted soils. And then if I'm fumigating after that, again, the fumigation often done using ripper shanks, and they may be quite deep. The disc ripper is typically going in 15 to 18 inches, whereas the disc, we're looking about a 6 to 8 inch depth. The fumigation would also be the same. The point of the ripper may be close to 15 inches, whereas my injection point may be around 9 to 10 inches deep. And then after I fumigated, I will typically wait 3 weeks. The label on it says to give it 14 to 21 days. And that's between planting. We have found that we want to disturb that soil. We want to wait as long as we can, basically, to disturb the soil so that we keep the fumigation down in the soil. And so at that point, then we'll come in, we'll mark out our rows. So this year, I've already done my McFarland harrow. I've already irrigated the field to get the wheat germinated. I've actually dry disked it once already. And I may or may not do it another time, but we will probably pull the disc ripper in here in a couple of weeks. And we try to fumigate actually later in the season. And I'll talk about more about that in just a minute. Typically, there's a number of fumigants that we could use. I'm just going to focus on metam sodium because it's the most common one that's used in our area, the metam sodium potassium, because it's effective against Verticillium dallii. And that is the most common of all the soil-borne pathogens that we're typically targeting with the fall fumigation. There is some nematicide activity to these. It gets root lesion, and it can control root, not if the numbers are quite low. And you get some weed control with it. The biggest problem with using fumigants like metam, sodium, or potassium is you have a very high active ingredient load. So in my case, in our area, it's very common to use 40 gallons per acre or 374 liters per hectare. That is 170 pounds of active ingredient per acre. And to give you a sense, or many of you maybe have thought through this, one thing about being sustainable is saying, can we cut down the pounds of active ingredient that we put out in the field? If I set the fumigation aside and I look at the pounds of AI that I put on, say from planting until harvest, usually that's somewhere less than 10 pounds for me. It may be close to 10. And yet I'm putting on 170 in the fall before. So if I'm in a situation where I want to cut down my total AI, my total active ingredient I'm putting into a field, this is the place that I'm going to want to do that. If I can cut back on the fumigation, that would be very easy to cut down the pesticide load. And it's going to save me some money. It's one of the more expensive things that we do. This past year, it cost me $5.50 a gallon. And so at 40 gallons, I think that was $220 per acre. And this year, I've already been quoted that it will be up almost 30%. In fact, based on my initial contacts, if I go at the same rate, I'm going to be spending over $300 an acre this year if I choose to use a metam-based fumigant. And so again, there's restrictions on it, regulation. There's also soil moisture requirements. You want to have a moist soil to keep that fumigant in. And if you don't have that, and you don't have access to water, then this is a problem and it doesn't work as well. There are some great resources that talk about fumigation, they talk about verticillium management. And this is, I took a screenshot of the Focus on Potato website. These are freely available for people to watch. And there are two in particular. There's a good one by Dennis Johnson called Verticillium Wilt, Potato Early Dying. And then there's one by Neil Goodmestad called Optimizing Shank Injection Fumigation Using Metam Sodium. It is an outstanding presentation. If any of you are using shank fumigation, shank injection to fumigate metam sodium, I highly recommend you listen to Dr. Goodmestad's presentation, because he talks about many, many factors that go into determining a successful fumigation. And just to highlight a few of those, his research shows that cooler temperatures are better. So if you can do it under 10 degrees centigrade or 50 degrees Fahrenheit, you're going to be better off. In fact, he showed that fumigating at about 4 degrees centigrade was better than 13 or even 15. And part of that is you have slower movement of the active ingredient in the soil, so it stays in the soil longer. He also found that a single injection depth was just as effective as two. So whether you're 25 centimeters down or whether you did a split injection, both of those were highly effective. Some people will talk about doing a split thinking that, well, I want to inject some of my fumigate higher up in the soil because I have more verticillium there. But one problem, a potential problem with that is when it is higher in the soil, it's also closer to the soil surface. And so some of that active ingredient that's put at the higher depth, or maybe I should say at a shorter depth, it's going to reach the surface faster and dissipate quicker. Some of the things that he pointed out is that when you get to warmer temperatures, you have more of a rate response. And again, this has to do with you lose the active ingredient quicker when the temperature is warmer. And that's why if you can go to cooler temperature, you're better off. So for me and my farms, we try to fumigate usually the latter half of October. We like to be somewhere around the 20th, because by then our soil temperatures have dropped right around below 45 Fahrenheit. They're getting down pretty close to 4 degrees centigrade. And one final thing that he showed is that when you use fumigation, we don't always see a yield increase. We typically do, but more consistently, we see a higher marketable yield increase when we do that. One thing that's, I guess, good to point out is that we're talking about broadcast fumigation. And in this picture, I took a picture of the shanks, the sweeps that are used to inject that, and they're staggered so that you have basically there's no space between those sweeps, and that as the fumigate is being injected, hopefully it's going throughout the entire soil profile. And I have a little cartoon here that will show what this is supposed to look like. So here's, let's say, a cross section of our soil. Those little red dots represent verticillium propagules, and I come in there and I'll inject that fumigant down there, say 9 inches below the soil surface, and I'm hoping that's going to move itself upward. And as it does that, it will eliminate, hopefully, most of the verticillium propagules that I have. And that's, of course, the theory behind broadcast fumigation. One effort that we've looked at recently to cut down on that is to use what we call an in-row fumigation. So instead of having these large, broad sweeps, we have these narrower points, and the injection point is right on the back of that sweep that's going down in the field. We may be using 20 to 30 gallons per acre. So in some cases, they're cutting it by half. Maybe they're cutting it by 25%. And the big change is you have a lot less of your total AI per acre, and the cost per acre is less. Additionally, you're going through the field one less time. So in this case, we have cut out one pass through the field. And the idea behind that is that you come in, I'm going to form these hills, inject my fumigant right here in the row, and it's going to clear out the pathogens that are in that one area, and hopefully I have a clean area for it to grow. And this has been, as we've shown it to be effective. It's better than not fumigating. We see significant increases in yield and quality, and we're using less product. Now, it hasn't always been as good as the broadcast, but it still does very well. In fact, here's showing some gross returns. This is calculating the cost of the application in. So I'm calculating what it cost me to fumigate, and I'm also looking at the dollar return I got for selling my potatoes. And in this case, looking at a processing contract, It statistically was similar to a broadcast fumigation if you compare the yellow and the green lines there on the left hand of the slide. But on the right hand, on the fresh pack, it wasn't statistically similar, but it still was better than not doing anything at all. So I see there's well, I don't know if I'm supposed to answer the questions or not. I'll come to those maybe in just a moment. But the question is, can we do without it? Can we use less? And what are some alternatives? And I will address one thing is that some people bring up, does fumigation sterilize the soil? And that is actually a pretty big myth. Fumigation does not sterilize the soil. Now, it does affect the microbes that are in there, and it does knock them back. But the most recent research that was done by Carl Rosen and his associates at Minnesota, looking at what we would call indicators of soil health, they found that when you fumigate in the spring, and when you fumigate, you see this drop in the microbial populations. They recover quite quickly. And usually by the end of the season, by the end of the potato growing season, they're back to where they were at pre-fumigation levels. Do we have alternatives? And we can use some green manures. Many things have been tried, but none have been proven as effective, say, as fumigation. But if that's taken away, I see someone saying they don't do that anymore. In your environment, maybe you can do that. If we lose fumigation, we will see a drop in production. That would be the first thing. Can we use, say, green manure crops to take their place? Because in some cases, we would consider it biofumigation. They're going to work best the more biomass that you get. And so if I'm putting this in, say in the fall, I'm going to have to fertilize them and irrigate them. I'm also got to control weeds. We have done some work using that. We've also done some work using a dedicated season to plant green manures versus a double crop. The picture on the upper right-hand corner shows a wheat crop here. This is actually a soil health experiment or project that we're doing. And here we've got, it's late in the season. My spring wheat crop is mature and it's about ready to be harvested. And next to it, I have a green manure crop that we've grown as a dedicated crop during the season. And we're about to plow that under. Research that's been done for University of Idaho shows that using a dedicated season is much more effective than trying to use a double crop when it comes to increasing the activity of your soil microbial communities. You do have to incorporate this while the plant is green and growing. So you have that decaying organic matter that will also improve your soil tilth. It improves water infiltration. Now, in some cases, we're relying on this to be a biofumigant. And quite honestly, it's releasing the same product that we get when we put down VAPAM in the soil. And so if we are worried about the VAPAM and the effect it has on the soil microbiology, you have to understand that the biofumigants are going to do a similar thing. Now, maybe not to the same degree, but they are going to take out some of those organisms. Now, Jim Davis, who did a lot of work at the University of Idaho, he found that the incorporation of these green manures does improve your microbial community, and this is totally independent of biofumigation. In fact, he would often say that he didn't really care about biofumigation. He was more concerned about increasing the numbers and the species diversity in the soil. And so as you have those decaying green plants, they cause this flush of microbes. And many of those are able to colonize the potato roots the following season. And by that colonization, they're able to exclude some of the pathogens or limit the effect of the pathogens. So Dr. Davis was able to show that he could use some green manures that would have no effect whatsoever on verticillium wilt or the verticillium populations in the soil. But he could show a significant decrease in the expression of wilt in the plants the next year. And he was able to tie that back to the presence of certain microbial species that would flourish or improve with the use of green manures. And he also pointed out soil temperature is very important there. When you're incorporating green matter under cold soils, they're going to take longer to break down. And you may not have that increase of microbes like you would see if you were incorporating when the soil is warmer. So I mentioned this about the suppression of wilt without the reduction of verticillium dallii numbers. Again, it's about getting the green biomass incorporated. And he also pointed out it may take multiple years to establish this effect. So some potential is, I visit with growers in my area. These are things that they say are the possible advantages and disadvantages. And this may be different for you. I know I've visited with a few different people who are doing some of this work in other areas where you have more water available to you. And so under those scenarios, you may not see some of these problems that we have. But we know that if we use green manures, we're going to get an increased supply of nutrients. We do see we get improved yield and quality doing these, improved soil health, organic matter, water holding. There is suppression of some pests, and we do have a reduction in soil erosion. So I know all these are good. They check the box in trying to be more sustainable. But some disadvantages that we have is there may be reduced income in some places. So we have had some growers who have tried to do this, and at the end they say, well, financially, I couldn't make it work. I was actually having more money go out, especially if you're telling me I can't plant a crop during a season. I have to dedicate it to a green manure. There's also the seed, tillage, and the irrigation costs. And when I say costs, it's not only just the money, but also the time. For many of our growers, the time when they would be, say, planting a green manure or doing the tillage or irrigation, and also it's right during harvest of some of their other crops. And so they aren't always able to give the time that they need to raise these properly. Availability of water can be a big issue for us. And then there are also potential weed problems. Some of these green manures can come back to become weeds. And some cases we've seen they might increase pest populations, such as nematodes. We know some species have actually made nematodes flourish. So I've kind of given an overview for how it is that we approach it and some of the things that I guess that we consider. And with that, actually, I will stop and either take questions or turn it over to Manpool at this time.
Thanks so much, Jeff. Such a great job on that. And remember, everyone, we are going to have a question and answer session. We'll just do it after Manpool's presentation. So if you have any questions for Jeff or coming up for Manpool, please feel free to ask those in the chat box and we'll answer them live on screen after the presentations. And so our final presenter today is Manpool Verzeri, and he's a senior scientist and manager of the McCain's Farm of the Future. Manpool was born and raised on a family farm business in India. He completed his undergraduate, master's, and PhD in sustainable crop production and has over 25 years of experience as an agronomist. Manpool is the current manager of McCain's Farm of the Future, located in Florenceville, Bristol, New Brunswick. And at the farm, they do regenerative agricultural practices and innovative technologies. They test them to show their economic viability and regional scalability. Take it away, please, Manpool.
Ashley, thank you so much for a nice introduction, and thanks, Jeff, for a nice talk. And Jeff has covered importance of both chemical fumigation and biofumigation and how you can use them efficiently in disease management, whether verticillium wilt or nematodes. Well, my talk is more about regenerative agriculture, which is based on 6 different principles of regenerative agriculture, including less soil disturbance, keep the soil surface covered, keep living roots in soil, biodiversity enhancement, animal integration, and chemical reduction. Well, at the Farm of the Future, we are implementing and also evaluating a large number of regenerative practices. And fall healing and cover cropping is one of them. As you know, that growing a potato crop is a 365-day process, and fall means it's time to prepare the ground, make hills, and plant cover crops. Currently, at the Farm of the Future, we are in the process of making fall hills and seeding different cover crops. The following spring, potatoes will be planted directly in the hills without additional tillage. So, what are the benefits of fall ridging and cover crops? Well, you all know that spring is very busy time for the year for a grower. It can be a big relief for them if they can complete the field preparation work in the fall. This way, the growers will be more efficient in timely planting of not only potatoes, but grains as well. We noticed that hills prepared in fall dry faster than smooth ground or recently prepared ground. We have also learned that if we can plant our potatoes earlier in the season, especially long season varieties like Russet Burbank, we can harvest 5 to 10% more yield. Therefore, timely and early planting is very important for us to get higher yields of potatoes. Once the field is so before preparing the field, we need to terminate our crop. So how we terminate our crop and how we prepare the field at the farm the future? Well, what we do is we terminate our existing crop by using a flail mower and then incorporate the biomass to the upper surface of the soil using a chisel plow. So at the farm of the future, we have completely stopped using the moldboard plow. Sometimes we have to make 2 passes of chisel plow to terminate the crop, which is quite expensive. And also we don't want to disturb our soil. Therefore, going forward, we want to make sure that how can we terminate our crop by single pass of chisel plow. We are in the process of evaluating different methods of terminating existing cover crops before making the hills. So once the field is prepared, we make our hills using the basket healer that you can see in the first picture that we use for healing of our potatoes. And you can see that healing and seeding of cover crop is done simultaneously in the one pass. You can see that air seeder is sitting on the back of the healer. So last year, we prepared hills in the first week of September, which was a little bit late, but still you can see in the second picture that by October 18, our cover crops grew over 10 inches. Our seeding rate was low, only 30 pounds of oats and 5 pounds of brown mustard per acre. So in total, we used only 35 pounds of seed. We are comparing between different cover crops to find out which crops are good in the region. So in this slide, you can see that cover crops, oats and brown mustard were killed by frost as we had wanted them to killed by frost. This way, we don't worry about terminating them in spring, because if you have to terminate them in spring, then that means you have an extra work, right? However, these cover crops hold the soil in place, prevent erosion, and improve the drainage. Additionally, cover crops also improve the soil biology. So as I mentioned before, at the farm of the future, we don't prepare field in spring before planting potatoes. So here potatoes are planted directly into these residue hills. Since we don't have to prepare our field in spring, we can use our resources in planting grains. And last week, we invited a large number of growers, and they mentioned that, well, they are very busy in spring because they have to prepare the field and then they have to plant the potatoes. So then I suggested that if they can prepare the hills in fall, then in spring, they just have to plant the potatoes, so they don't have to prepare the ground. And that the time they use to prepare the ground, that time and resources, they can use planting the grains. So if you can plant your grains and potatoes early, definitely you can start harvesting little bit earlier. So in the first picture, you can see that sometimes your cover crops can become a weed too. You can see kale volunteers from the cover crop planted in the spring 2021. Therefore, when you select your cover crop, you should make it sure that that cover crop doesn't become a weed for you. And therefore, we are comparing between different cover crops. We are doing a lot of trials to understand more about different cover crops at the farm of the future. So this slide is about potatoes performance. Those we planted through hills, those we prepared in fall last year. So the potatoes planted through hills without tilling, field in spring shows excellent performance of potato crop. In New Brunswick, definitely we are lucky that we have received high heat units and good rain this season. Additionally, we planted whole seed of potatoes instead of cut seed, which resulted in high set of uniform tubers. And I think most of potato growers know that in North America, most of the growers plant the cut seed. But if you go to Europe, continental Europe, growers plant the whole seed. And we encourage our growers to plant the whole seed, then the cut seed. In addition to brown mustard and oats, we also tried winter rye as a cover crop. And you know that winter rye is very aggressive, it's winter hardy as compared to oats and brown mustard. But winter rye is not killed by frost. And therefore, in spring, before planting potatoes, you need to terminate the winter rye. So how you terminate that? And we are working on it. So you have to have spray the around, right? So this is an additional expense and there's more work. So now it's a grower's choice whether he wants to plant oats or brown mustard or tillage radish, which will get killed by winter. So in that case, he or she doesn't have to terminate the cover crops in the spring, or a grower who wants to plant the fall rye in fall, definitely they have to terminate the fall rye before planting the potatoes or after planting the potatoes. So that's depends upon a grower, right? So every crop has their own advantage and disadvantage. So potatoes planted through the winter rye looks excellent, and we don't see any negative effect on potato that we planted through the winter rye. We will be digging many 10-foot digs this coming week to see is there any negative effect of winter rye on the yield. We dig some plants. We really didn't take much yield data, but so far the crop looks really good. So we really don't see any negative effect of fall rye. But until we don't dig all our 10-foot digs, we really don't know whether there's any positive or negative effect of fall rye, because we are comparing so many these different crops, and we are doing so many trials in our different fields. These are replicated trials, so we will definitely know whether these cover crops have any positive or negative impact on yield and quality of potatoes. So in conclusion, preparing field in fall making hills and planting cover crops in fall have several benefits. It will expedite potato planting, reduce labor and fuel cost, and remove the requirement of harrowing the ground in the spring, which is a lot of work for a grower. Because, as I mentioned before, springs are really busy for us. Therefore, we wanted to prepare our ground in the fall and also want to plant cover crops so that we don't lose any more topsoil, which is a big issue with us. Additional benefits of include reducing soil compaction, soil erosion during the off season, that may be fall, winter, and early spring, as well as increasing our ability to improve soil organic matter, contribute to soil biology, and reduce soil-borne pest and disease pressure in potato crop. Like Jeff mentioned, we have problems of nematodes. We also have problems of verticillium wilt, early blight or late blight. So, and because of them, we have to spray our crop weekly. So we want to make sure that by planting diverse cover crops, how we can reduce the inoculum of all those diseases and how we can cut in chemicals. However, we suggest our growers to start at a small scale and learn and expand the practice accordingly, because as I mentioned before, that every cover crop is different, and when you start planting those cover crops, there's a lot of learning, like when you should be planting, how much seed you should be planting, when you should be terminating, how you should be terminating, and you also want to make sure that a cover crop doesn't become a weed problem for you, because it takes a while to understand about cover crops. Therefore, I suggest that growers should do their own trials and select the right cover crops for them to get maximum benefits. Thank you so much, and I would love to answer the questions. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Manful. You guys both did really interesting presentations. I know I learned a lot, and I'm really excited to ask you guys some of these questions. So just a reminder, if you have any questions that you'd like to ask Jeff or Manful, please feel free to ask them in the chat, and we will start on asking questions right now. So I think our first question comes from during Jeff's presentation. What about using ammonium as liquid? Will act as a source of nitrogen and sterilize also. Jeff, any comments on that?
Okay, say that again. Using what as a liquid?
Ammonium as a liquid will act as a source of nitrogen and sterilize also.
So, well, I'm probably not really qualified to answer that question. It's normal for us to make an application of nitrogen, usually in the form of like 1137 or 1152 nitrogen and phosphorus in the furrow at planting in a band that's below the seed piece and to the side. And typically, there's not a lot that's going on then. I would say it's maybe 30 to 50 units. Maybe I should be a little lower than that. Most of the nitrogen that we put on is either done after the potatoes have been planted and before they've been rehilled, before they've emerged, and then through the season. We put a lot onto the water. I don't have any evidence to say that those applications of nitrogen are really sterilizing the soil. We don't see really, I guess, a difference in like say carbon dioxide release. Or definitely they don't seem to have any impact on pests. So I don't know if that answered the question, but I think that's what I would say about the nitrogen effect.
Thank you, Jeff. And our next question comes from during Manful's presentation. They're asking, was the seed treated prior to planting?
You mean seed treatment?
Yes, they were wondering if you guys did seed treatments on your trials.
Yes, definitely no. We didn't treat our seed. Yeah.
And what's the latest date that fall rye should be seeded when you guys are doing your trial? What did you guys find when you were doing your trials, and what would you recommend, Manful?
Can you repeat the question?
It was from during your presentations. What is the latest date that fall rye should be seeded?
Oh yes, yeah. So well, it depends from region to region, right? But last year, we seeded on 8th of September, and it performed really well, right? This year, maybe we would like to seed it next week. Uh, uh, but I think you can go a bit late too. It depends upon the weather too. Like last year, the fall was not that bad, right? So even someone like seeded until say 15th of October, it worked okay. And we also did some work after harvesting potatoes, you don't have any other crop which you can plant which can protect your ground during winter time, right? So just before harvesting the potatoes, we sprayed some fall rye in 1 year that we did around September 20th. Still it worked, but because since you spread the seed of fall rye before harvesting potatoes, a lot of seed get buried. Therefore, you have to use the high seed rate. I know a couple of growers in PI, and they go up to 250 pounds of seed per acre, which is really really high. We never tried that high seeding rate. But this year, I'm doing a couple of trials about the different seeding rate, ranging up from 60 pounds per acre to 250 pounds per acre. So let us see what kind of result we get.
Thank you. And our next question is, what are the planter modifications needed to go into winter killed cover crops? And also, what modifications for going into green cover? And then brackets, they said fall rye.
Yeah, so last year, where we planted the oats and brown mustard, they got killed by winter. And in spring, we didn't have to do any modification or any change in our planter. And where we planted the fall rye, and that grew like 2 feet high, and we didn't spread the Roundup. So we planted through the fall rye, which was like more than 2 feet high. So what we did is that we just removed the front tooth from our planter. But other than that, we didn't make any changes or modification in our planter. In another field, there was a lot of residue in that field. We couldn't prepare the fall hills a year before. So this spring, we just terminated the clover, alfalfa, and timothy, and there was a lot of residue. And we thought that can we plant under that high residue? But we just had to remove the front tooth from the planter, and we were able to plant our potatoes. So I have learned that sometimes we see that if it's a high residue, we may not be able to plant, but that was not the case.
Thank you. And we have a question asking, what's the soil type where the fall ridging trials were done? And was there any impact to spring runoff from these fall ridged fields?
Yeah, so that's a great question because, it depends upon the, soil type. So our soils are like sandy loam and silty, combination of all these three. Our soils are not really, really like clay, So we are okay if we don't loosen the ground in spring, right? But maybe growers who have really the clay soil, and I really don't know whether they have to loosen the soil in spring. So I really cannot answer that. But this is a great question. Maybe in New Brunswick, some of the growers, they have shown interest in planting the cover crops and making hills in fall. and every grower is a little bit different in their soil type. So I will see if anyone has anyone needs loosen the soil in spring before planting the potatoes. But at the Farm the Future, definitely you don't have to prepare your ground at all in spring. You can just plant the potatoes through those hills you prepared in fall.
Thank you. And we have another question asking, is fall bridging on fall hilling being adopted by growers? And are your trials available online to see the results?
So I think the question is that either I can share the results and either growers have adopted, right?
Yeah, they're asking, is it being adopted by growers?
Oh, yeah. Okay. So, well, so at the Farm the Future, this is our second year, and we are so happy to implement these practices at the Farm the Future. Last year, we covered only 70 acres. This year, we are covering our entire potatoes under fall irrigation and cover cropping. And at McCain, we have Valley Farm, and they plant 1,800 acres of potatoes. And this year they are going to try the making fall hills and cover cropping this season because they impressed with our field, with our work. And we had a field day last week. A large number of growers from both Maine and New Brunswick participated in our field day. A lot of growers uh, uh, showed an interest to make the fall hills and plant the cover crops. I'm really not sure how many those growers going to try the making the hills and planting the cover crops this season. But we are in this process because at the Farm the Future, one of our objective is to not only implement these regenerative practices, but simultaneously we are evaluating them, and we bring a lot of growers over here to show them the results, and definitely we will be able to convince them, and I'm sure that they are going to see the benefits of fall bedding and cover cropping as we see here at the Farm of the Future. By next year, we will have definitely more data to convince them.
And then there's just a second part to that question asking if your trials are available online.
They are not available online, but what we can do is that maybe you can share my email with them, or because we have McCain growers, right? So I have their email. So all the McCain growers, they can contact me directly, and they do contact me directly, right? We have our agronomy North America team, so they are they work together with our growers. But if any grower anywhere in the world, if they want to know more about fall bedding and cover cropping, we would love to share our results, our knowledge with them.
Thank you. And I have a question for Jeff. Would you be able to explain the true effects of fumigation? This person's mentioning the boost in soil health, and they're just commenting that there's still some people that think that fumigation destroys the soil biome.
Okay, so there's no doubt that fumigation is hard on the soil, that it's not. And I would say that I don't know of too many people who, I don't know of anybody who enjoys fumigating. If we could make it go away, I think it would be a wonderful thing. But it does offer some tangible benefits. And I think what gets lost in some of the messaging is I think one person mentioned, I was trying to look at the phrase in the chat box about, it said kill all soil life was the phrase used. Fumigation would kill all soil life. And the data do not support that thought. Some work that was done, summarized, this was in the American Journal of Potato Research in 2021. If anyone's interested in looking this up, it was on issue 90 or volume 98, page 300. Carl Rosen and a group looked at multiple trials over multiple years, and they measured the soil microbiology basically by the carbon dioxide release over a 24-hour period. And so they had soils that were not fumigated and soils that received chloropicrin and metam-sodium. And before anything had been done, all of them were releasing over 50 parts per million of CO2 per hour. So it's a good sense of maybe the baseline respiration that's going on in the soil. Now, once they applied the fumigants, then they had a significant drop in both the chloropicrin and the metam-sodium. So there was an overall reduction in the amount in the soil microbiology. Okay, that was dropped significantly. The drop was greater for metam than it was for chloropicrin. So sometimes you'll hear people, the chloropicrin folks say, well, hey, we're not as hard on the soil health. And from that standpoint, that's true. Now, as the season went on, though, you saw a recovery, if you would, in both the chloropicrin and the metam-sodium. By the end of the season, in fact, after they had harvested the crop, there was no difference in the respiration between a soil that had not been fumigated and one that had. So they said you are taking out pathogens, you are taking out the good guys, if you will, but they do come back. Now that's not to say that, well, that means we should just do fumigation. We shouldn't look for alternatives. I know I think there's good reason to find alternatives to it, but my message is in our environment it really is helpful. And it's not as bad, I guess, as it's always made out to be in some of the popular press.
Thanks so much, Jeff. That was really informative. And I have a question for Manful. Does fall hilling require hilling again during the growing season at all?
Yeah, so in spring, no, we really don't prepare the ground again in spring. That's the question, or?
Yeah, that was a question. You answered it perfectly.
Yes, yeah, no. So we now we already have prepared the fall beds and planted cover crops in our I think we covered close to 70-80 acres. We have to plant some more cover crops and maybe in another 70-80 acres. But I think this is the right time to make the hills and plant the cover crops. And then in spring, you don't have to prepare your ground at all. You just go and plant your potatoes. And last year, we were so happy that we made our fall beds a year before. And therefore, this year, we want to cover all our potato ground so that in spring, you can just go and plant your potatoes. And you know why that is important? Because as I mentioned before, if you can plant your crop early, you can get higher yield. You know why? Because in New Brunswick, we have a short growing season. And if you plant a crop like a variety like Russet Burbank, it's good to plant early to get really good yield. Also, like these hills, they dry faster, so you can start planting a couple of days earlier. So I think there are so many benefits, and we are really happy. And because you also plant a lot of grains too, so if we can plant our potatoes early, we can focus on our grains. So if you can plant both crops earlier, definitely you are not only going to get higher yield, but you can start harvesting them early. So there are so many benefits there.
Thank you, Manful. And I have one last quick question for you. Is there an opportunity to reduce K if applied in the hill in the fall?
So we are doing some trialing over there. So we really don't know. I don't have the answer yet, right? But what we do over here is that we use the soil optics. So we apply our 50% potassium in fall, and then rest of the potassium we apply at the time of potato planting. Not even half, very little we apply at the time of potato planting. So we do in fact a variable rate of application of potassium, right? But it's a great question. We'll be definitely doing some research over there and how we can reduce the application of potassium. But I just want to let you know that at the Farm the Future, one of our objective is to cut in fertilizer and chemicals, and we already have cut like 15% fertilizers. So we are using less nitrogen, less phosphorus, and less potash at the farm of the future, because we plant a lot of cover crops. We also have the animal integration. So our one of the goal is to keep cutting in fertilizer and chemicals.
Thanks, Manful, and I'll definitely be following up with you and keeping paying attention as you guys find out more results from these trials as you continue the growing seasons at the farm in the future. And I just want to say that's all we have time for today. And I'd quickly like to just say another thank you to our webinar speakers, Jeff and Manful, for joining us today. And I would also once again like to thank our sponsor, McCain, for making this webinar possible. And of course, a big thank you goes out to everyone who participated. We really enjoyed all your questions, and we're just thankful for you tuning in, and we hope that you learned something from this webinar. And again, a recording of this webinar will be made available shortly on spudsmart.com. Thanks again, and we hope you have a wonderful day.